In Oakland, a spontaneous ignition erupted into a deadly inferno.
We had fire on both sides of the road. It was a very dangerous situation.
The runaway fire overwhelmed even the best defenses.
I looked down in that canyon, I thought, all my guys down there are gonna die.
In 3 hours, the hilltop paradise became hell on earth.
The heat was incredible. I mean, it was like being in an oven.
Firefighters and residents would find themselves fighting blinding smoke and raging flames to save a city from a firestorm. On rolling hills overlooking Oakland, California, thousands of expensive homes were crowded into a lush urban forest. The only way in or out of this little paradise was a series of steep, narrow, winding roads. On Saturday, October 19th, 1991, the temperature was very hot and extremely dry. Oakland was in its 5th year of a drought. The signs of an impending catastrophe loomed large. Most of the homes in this area were built with wood frames and untreated wood shingle roofs. They sat amongst thick, flammable vegetation. Don Matthews, the shift commander for the Oakland Fire Department, was especially worried that these conditions were a recipe for disaster.
My feeling was we were sitting on a powder keg. It was very hot. The only redeeming feature was it wasn't windy, but it was pretty obvious that if anything went wrong weather-wise, or a fire started in the wrong place, we were in deep trouble.
It was early morning when Lynn Harrison arrived at her hilltop home on Buckingham Boulevard. She had just finished working the night shift as a respiratory therapist. Looking out the window, she happened to see smoke rising from her neighbor's yard.
There was a fire that was spreading, and this was not occupied land. This was actually space between my house and the neighbor's house.
The fire was working its way up an extremely steep hillside covered with brush and grass. Neighbors had already called it in. No one knew how it started. Fortunately, there was no wind, and there were no houses above the blaze. And because the response was quick and decisive, the brush fire was brought under control in about an hour.
Copy, primary search negative.
Yeah, mark this fire under control.
But as a precautionary measure, the firefighters left their hoses to be picked up the following morning. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Around 6 a.m. the next day, Oakland firefighter Mike Dolan was preparing to leave home to report for duty. The temperature was already over 80 degrees, very hot for that time of day. And unlike Saturday, the wind had picked up substantially. Oakland police officer John Grubensky was on patrol in his squad car. Sunday was his day off, but a personnel shortage forced him to work. On a hilltop house on the Berkeley-Oakland border, Sally Maxwell had just made a strawberry pie for her husband Robert Fierro and her 9-year-old daughter Mira. She was pregnant and was due to give birth within 48 hours.
I had gone into the doctor on Friday and I was already dilated. And he said he would induce labor by Tuesday if I didn't have the baby, so I was really tired.
Hey, babe, how you doing?
It was a lazy Sunday morning for Dr. Delmar Sanders, a neurosurgeon with a 25-year practice in Oakland. Awakened early by the heat, he was enjoying a cup of coffee with his friend Carol Kapner before finishing up some work.
Tina's looking forward to.
Outside, the winds were rapidly intensifying, blowing extremely hot, dry air throughout the area.
This is the devil wind that the Indians and the early settlers called it. It's so dry that it just sucks the moisture out of everything. When you get that wind, a slight spark will start a fire. You can throw a cigarette out in a day like this and whatever's there starts burning.
Around 8 a.m., firefighters were returning to the site of Saturday's blaze to pick up the hoses they had left behind. They were surprised to find that several little fires had re-emerged. They immediately radioed Don Matthews that they needed backup.
It was so hot and dry at that point that this buried fire that had been totally wet down the night before was coming up through like little volcanoes.
Mike Dolan was one of the firefighters who got the call. He and his company from Oakland Fire Station 13 headed out toward the hills. For the next 2 hours, fire crews dug through thick layers of leaves and pine needles, pouring water on hot spots. But the effort was ineffective. Each time a fire was controlled, others popped up. In Berkeley, the city just north of Oakland, Mary Pretlow noticed smoke rising from a nearby hill. She asked her husband James to take a look.
What do you think it is?
They were a city away, and like Dr. Sanders, did not feel that they were in any immediate danger.
I did not think it was serious. I really didn't. I just could not believe that this fire could ever reach us.
Matthews went to the scene to check out the situation in person.
We got a real problem up there, but the fire is all around us. It's moving over here to the east side.
The fire had erupted and leapt to an unburned area. Within moments, the brush fire, fueled by gusting winds, began to spread out of control. Lynn Harrison was startled by the sound of banging on her front door.
It was a man
Lynn, the brush fire's on
yelling at me that the fire had restarted and for me to get up and get out of there. It never entered my mind that that fire would start again.
She quickly ran outside, grabbed a garden hose, and began to wet down her roof, hoping to prevent flying embers from igniting it.
It was coming up my hillside. There were several fires, and there became several more fires because they would just ignite. They would just start right in front of your eyes.
At the same time, the Pretlows walked outside their Berkeley home to get a better look at the situation. They found one of their gardeners anxiously wetting down the house.
The wind was blowing very hard, and as they were putting water on the shake roof, it was evaporating as fast as they put it on there. So they decided that they wanted to just leave.
Firefighters at the Berkeley Fire Department were alerted of the fire raging in Oakland. Even though it had not crossed into Berkeley, Captain David Orth and his men responded.
We had radios turned on. We started prepping. We're going to go. Multiple units flowed up into the hills. By the time we got there, we had fire on both sides of the road. I could see fire down below us, coming around in a canyon. It was a very dangerous situation.
By 11 o'clock, 3 hours after it had rekindled, the fire in Oakland began spreading at a staggering rate. Every 4.5 seconds, a house literally exploded in flames. The wind was pushing the fire so swiftly that it jumped over roads and past fire lines. Robert Fierro noticed black smoke and fire in the hills, but couldn't determine where it was coming from. He didn't like the looks of the situation and felt his family should leave.
Why don't you get the picture?
He asked Sally to pack up whatever she could. Their daughter Mira was frightened by what she saw.
I looked out the window and I just saw a wall of flames, nothing else. I couldn't see the sky. And so I saw that and I screamed, and the next thing I knew, we were out of here.
Matthews watched as his men tried to battle what was once a brush fire, but had now become a monster.
At one point, I looked down in that canyon, I thought, all my guys down there are gonna die. The fire was going over my head through eucalyptus trees and dropping down, and I had to move the car several times to try and keep looking down the canyon, keep a view without getting burned up myself.
Matthews ordered more backup, including aerial drops of flame-retardant chemicals. Units on the ground were finding it difficult to negotiate the steep terrain and maneuver around residents fleeing in a mass panic.
If you're trying to fight a fire, you cannot also evacuate, especially in the hill area where you have this terrible condition of substandard roads, steep hills, and people tending not to want to evacuate until the last minute. So it creates a tremendous problem. We need heavy police presence.
Officer Grabinski had been monitoring the fire's progress all morning. Even though he was not assigned to that area, he knew he had to try and help. With his siren blaring, he slowly made his way into the neighborhood. Dr. Sanders had been oblivious to the fire all morning until a neighbor alerted him to the danger across the street. He decided he and Carol should get out. They hastily grabbed a few photographs and business files to take with them. To save their cars from possible damage, they drove down the hill separately. Kapner was in the lead, with Sanders right behind her. When they turned onto Charing Cross Road, they immediately became part of a long line of cars, all trying to get away at once. Sizing up the situation, Kapner took charge and waved for Sanders to turn around. But as he tried to follow her, another car came in behind him and blocked his exit.
I was stuck. I wasn't moving. The flames were around, the houses were burning. My heart was beating, and I was looking for any way whatsoever to get out of this place.
Firefighters Mike Dolan and Captain Steve Cuneo were instructed to work their way down the hill to Buckingham Boulevard to try to contain and control the fire in that area.
You could feel the wind just blowing embers everywhere. It really had intensified the area of the fire.
Outside the Pretlow's Berkeley home, James wanted to get a closer look at the fire through his video camera.
And all of a sudden I noticed, I got a little concerned because I started seeing flashes of orange coming down a canyon behind us.
James knew they were now going to have to evacuate. Dolan and Cuneo came across Lynn Harrison, who was still trying to wet her house down. They told her she had to leave immediately. She insisted she had to find her pets first.
I was a little confused at this point. This is all kind of happening very quickly, and I went in and gathered up a few things and, was just kind of racing around in my head.
She found one of her dogs and brought it out to the car for safekeeping. Lynn then told the firemen she still had to find her cat and another dog. Dolan and Cuneo insisted she act quickly because they weren't sure how long they could hold the fire back.
We took a position that we could possibly save this house. I looked to my right and I could see like 2 or 3 other houses that were fully involved.
Right before Dolan's eyes, an entire neighborhood was vanishing. After James's warning, Mary Prutlow packed pictures, important papers, and other mementos. She knew California brush fires were notorious for leaping freeways and hillsides in minutes. Their speed and direction could change instantly. Mary knew they had no time to waste. James loaded up both cars and they drove off. They headed down the hill, unsure of what they were going to confront. At Harrison's house, Dolan and Cuneo had given up fighting the fire. Realizing the pool was their only chance of survival, they dragged Lynn toward it. And not a moment too soon.
It was very fast. The whole house was engulfed within seconds.
Now their only means of escape was blocked by a wall of fire. They hoped the pool would keep them from being burned alive. By 12:30, the fire was consuming everything in sight, and firefighters were quickly realizing they were waging a losing battle.
This thing just turned totally deadly in a few minutes. I had never seen anything like this. I knew the potential was there, but I never thought it could be just a total disaster like this in such a short time. It was a disaster, and I was in charge of the disaster, and there wasn't a darn thing I could do about it.
Don Matthews was now in the middle of the firestorm. All he could do was wait and hope that help would arrive before the situation turned into a raging inferno. For over 3 hours, the hills above Oakland, California were engulfed in the most destructive wildland urban fire in U.S. history. Hundreds of homes were burning out of control. Rescuers battling the blaze were confounded by narrow roads and residents in sheer panic. Don Matthews, the shift commander for the Oakland Fire Department, had the job of not only saving lives, but saving an entire city from obliteration.
The major effort was to try to pinch off this fire, get ahead of it, draw boundary lines around it, and control it because it was going down into the city at a rapid rate.
Helicopters from the California Department of Forestry dropped thousands of gallons of water, but the 2,000-degree heat from the fire below caused it to evaporate before it reached the ground. Calls began coming in, reporting hot embers falling 10 miles away in San Francisco.
Ashes were falling in Pacifica on the ocean, so this is how far the thermal column and the wind drove the products of this fire. It was incredible.
At the base of the hills, the fire was nearing the 4-story Parkwood Apartments complex. Residents were running for their lives. Charlie Tucker was sleeping in his 4th-floor apartment when it began to fill with smoke. He awoke to the sounds of a roaring fire and knew he had to get out. Not knowing the extent of the fire, he went down to the garage below the apartments. Since he didn't know what else to do or where else to go, he decided to get in his car and wait it out. Higher up in the hills, police officer John Grabensky was trying to untangle a traffic jam on Charing Cross Road. Panicked motorists had brought the area's evacuation to a standstill. He knew he had to keep things moving if anybody was going to get through. In Berkeley, the Maxwell-Fierro family were also trying to escape. Sally decided her daughter would ride with her, and Robert would follow them down the hill.
I was obviously scared, didn't know what was gonna happen, just this overwhelming fear about life in general, because you're left not knowing what on earth's gonna happen.
As I was driving, I realized I'd left my cat. And during this whole time, my daughter is screaming. She's saying, "You can't go in, Mommy. We'll die. You'll kill the baby. You can't go. Don't go in. Don't go in."
Sally approached the house anyway. Then suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door shut.
To me, that was the omen. That's like, you can't go in the house now. You just have to go. So I didn't go. I didn't go in.
By noon, the fire had spread from Oakland to Berkeley. Captain David Orth and his company were trying to stop the fire in the El Camino neighborhood. But it was moving so quickly, it was destroying everything in its path.
This wind blowing it horizontally would just ignite the exterior of houses before the interior would ever burn. And then the whole house would blow up.
James and Mary Pretlow were still making their way down the hill. After driving only a few blocks, James signaled Mary to stop.
Look, I can't do this, okay? I gotta go back and save the house.
What, have you lost your mind, James? You can't go back there. Baby, just let the house burn.
I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. You just go to safety.
James!
Just go.
James!
Go!
In Oakland, Dr. Delmar Sanders was still stuck on Charing Cross Road. He was growing increasingly frustrated at the traffic.
We didn't know what was in front of us. I did know what was behind us, and I knew we couldn't get out the lower part of Charing Cross.
He decided to abandon his car and search for another way out. Mary Pretlow's progress down the hill was repeatedly slowed by burning embers striking her windshield. The smoldering ashes made it difficult to see. She was frightened, but knew she had to continue. Her husband, James, had returned to their house to discover that fire was surrounding it. He tried to extinguish the flames, but there was little he could do. Lynn Harrison's home was quickly becoming a charred frame.
And we could see her house, and it was totally involved. The flames probably maybe 60 to 100 feet in the air.
With fiery debris falling everywhere, firefighters Dolan and Cuneo suggested they use the pool cover for protection. Lynn hadn't stopped worrying about her pets.
I said, I want to get my dogs. My dogs are out front. They said, your dogs will take care of themselves. They'll be okay. Of course, none of us knew that that fire was going to be that kind of fire that it was.
Dolan knew they were cornered in the pool, and there was no other place to escape to. Within minutes, it became very hot and uncomfortable under the cover. The fire was sucking the oxygen out of the air. Fearing the plastic would melt, Cuneo began splashing water on it. Underneath, Harrison and Dolan were struggling to breathe.
I remember looking at Steve, shaking my head and saying, you know, we're not going to make it. And he just looked down, and he looked just real sad, and he just shook his head.
All the while, they could hear the unsettling sounds of fiery destruction closing in on them. They had no idea how long they would have to remain in the pool, or if they would even survive. By 1 p.m., 50-mile-an-hour winds were fueling an enormous firestorm over hundreds of acres in the hills of Oakland and Berkeley, California. Entire blocks had burned down or were on fire. Hundreds of residents were fleeing for their lives. Officer John Grubensky had been helping people evacuate from the Oakland hills. At the corner of Charing Cross and Sherwood Roads, he was instructing residents how to get through the smoke-clogged streets to safety. Neurosurgeon Dr. Delmar Sanders was trying to get through the gridlock on foot. Amidst the confusion, he came across Officer Grubensky.
Here he was, standing, directing traffic, the fire and everything else going, and it was like making decisions moment by moment, or playing a game of chess in fast motion.
Dr. Sanders was puzzled by what he saw. Grubensky was directing people to go back towards the fire in order to get to safety. Grubensky reassured Sanders it was the only way out.
He was a take-charge person, and at the same time not panicking, not allowing people to go the wrong direction. And that's the reason I had no hesitation of going this time.
Sanders trusted Grubensky, but knew he couldn't walk through the flames. He flagged down the first passing vehicle. As the truck inched its way down the road, the driver became gripped by fear.
Once we got into the depth of the flames and smoke, he paused. He just sort of froze. I just took over and I says, "Damn it, move it."
The man hit the gas, and they moved again through what seemed like a road through hell. In Berkeley, James Pretlow was trying to prevent his home from being consumed by the fire. But it was a pointless effort.
I still can't believe how fast the flames arrived. I'm at our home. There's two houses next to us. They were both fully engulfed.
Then a single engine carrying 3 firefighters from Captain Orth's company arrived on scene. As Pretlow tried to save his home, they began fighting the flames on either side.
They had to fight the fire from our patio. The hoses had to be put in through our yard and over the fence to fight the fires next door.
The firefighters sprayed water on the burning houses, but it was futile. They didn't have enough manpower to save all these homes.
The lieutenant decided to let our home burn. And I told him, no, you couldn't do that, because if this home burned, that means that every other home in the neighborhood would go. So they decided to make a stand here.
Underground in the Parkwood Apartments garage, Charlie Tucker was still trying to figure out what to do next. He had been hiding in his car for over 2 hours and could hear the fire raging outside. But with smoke now filling the inside of the garage, he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay there. Sally Maxwell and her daughter Mira were beginning to make some headway down the hill. But the fires continued to grow threatening on both sides of the road.
It was so hot I felt my skin was going to blister. The heat was incredible. I mean, it was like being in an oven.
Sally kept thinking about her unborn child, but it was her daughter Mira that was her most immediate concern.
But I really wanted my daughter to live. I could care less about myself, and I was concerned about my baby, but at the same time, this baby hasn't seen the light of day. I've got to get my daughter out of this thing. And I tell you, I started praying.
With little choice, they continued on. Sally's husband, Robert, followed closely behind. In the pool, Lynn Harrison and firefighters Mike Dolan and Steve Cuneo were protecting themselves from the licking flames. The intense heat continued to draw the oxygen out of the air, making it harder and harder for them to breathe.
I remember kind of taking my head and going, my breath that I was taking was not satisfying. I mean, I wasn't getting enough air, and none of us were. And that was scary.
Dolan suggested that they try moving around the pool to see if they could find a spot with more oxygen.
He said, let's move. So we did. We moved around until we found a place that you could breathe fine.
Around them, the sounds of the fire were growing louder and louder. They listened as the house crumbled and disintegrated. Suddenly, Lynn was overcome by the enormity of the situation.
She started saying, oh, my heart, my heart, my heart. And Steve and I were getting very concerned. We asked her if she was okay. We thought, well, we're going to have to end up doing CPR in a pool. And when she said, no, her heart was just breaking because of all the hard work. And I just basically told her, get a grip, what the hell is going on, and the house is the least of our problem.
The firestorm continued to spread. It was a 6-alarm fire, and over 1,200 acres were ablaze. And then, the unthinkable happened. In many areas, the water stopped flowing.
Tanks of water that supplied them were just drained down because people basically had to disconnect from the fire hydrants by either cutting the hose or just leaving their equipment because the fire advanced so quickly. And as soon as that happened, the hydrants were left open. They drained out the system.
By early afternoon, several reservoirs had run completely dry, and the power to pump more water in other places had been knocked out by fallen power lines. Oakland and Berkeley, California had now become a total hell on earth. Oakland and Berkeley were being overrun by the worst firestorm in California history. In the first few hours, 790 homes and 456 apartments were completely destroyed. Water lines had been ruptured, depleting reservoirs. And even where there was a supply of water, the flames kept firefighters from getting to it. Ironically, Lynn Harrison and 2 firefighters were up to their necks in water. They were trapped in Lynn's swimming pool, using the plastic cover to protect themselves from flying hot embers. It was all they could do to keep the 50-mile-an-hour winds from tearing the cover off of them.
You could hear it. It was roaring. And it would whip the bubble. I mean, we had to hang on to it tight because the wind was just fierce. I mean, very fierce. We were really having to grip that thing in order for it not to be blowing away from us.
The Maxwell Fierro family had almost made it to the bottom of the hill when they ran into a traffic jam. But with the safety of her unborn baby and her daughter Mira in mind, Sally was determined to get around the tie-up using any means necessary.
I drove in the parking lane. I totally broke every traffic law, and I thought if I have to, I'll drive on the sidewalk. I'll do whatever it takes to get out of here.
In Berkeley, Mary Pretlow had reached a clearing. As she looked back toward the top of the hill, she could see that it was completely engulfed in flames. She had no idea if her husband James, who had gone back to try and save their home, was safe. Their house was still intact because her husband had convinced the firefighters to turn their hoses on it. They broke windows and doors, hoping to release enough of the hot air inside the house to prevent it from exploding into flames. Suddenly, out of nowhere, residents from the neighborhood who had not fled showed up, along with a few Berkeley College students, and began manning hoses. And not a minute too soon.
We literally had civilians hanging on to great big hose lines with big nozzles, 3 or 4 of them sitting on it to hold it to the ground, spraying these burning houses and keeping water on the surrounding houses that hadn't caught yet.
The Pretlows' house did catch fire, but James and the volunteers kept it from being a total loss.
If I had not been here, this house would have burnt to the ground. So they put up an effort to stem the fire here, because if this house had went up in flames, then the entire neighborhood would have burned.
Didn't stop the fire. The fire burned beyond us and around us, but at least we found that where we located and where we were able to form a line, we could hold the fire. And it would have spread from there uphill further if they hadn't been able to stop it at that location. What would have happened then? I don't know. Nobody really knows the dynamics of how far it would have spread into Berkeley, how many more homes would have been lost.
When it was over, James borrowed a cell phone from one of the volunteers, called his wife Mary, and told her that he was okay.
You cherish material things, but material things can be replaced. And I'm just very happy that Mary and I were able to get out of this situation. We were lucky to get away with our lives.
Back in Oakland, at the Parkwood Apartments, 3 hours had passed since Charlie Tucker had sought refuge inside his car parked in the underground garage. Everyone had long evacuated the building except for Tucker. He thought if he had lasted this long, perhaps he might survive. But heavier smoke had begun to seep into the garage. His breathing became strained. It was beginning to look like his luck was running out. When the sounds of the fire started subsiding, Mike Dolan looked out from under the cover and discovered that the fire had blown over the yard. Anxious to use the radio on the rig, Dolan got out to take a look. The truck was badly burned. The wooden handles on his tools had vaporized without a trace.
The only thing left was the heads of the metal, of the shovels, the axes, the rakes. There was not even any residue of ash. It had been so hot.
From deep in the cab, he was able to retrieve an oxygen tank. Because the heat was so unbearable, he immediately returned to the pool.
It was just a weird feeling to be walking around and just total destruction everywhere you looked. The 3 of us was the only thing alive in the area, and it was kind of odd.
Harrison had begun to have trouble breathing again, so Cuneo administered some oxygen. Dr. Sanders and the driver of the truck finally made it out of the fire zone. His friend Carol Kapner had already gotten down safely and was anxiously awaiting his return. Although he and Kapner were safe, he knew others were still in great peril as the fire continued to spread.
And when we got down the hill, it was already across the highway on the other side. It had engulfed the whole hill and gone hundreds of yards away from where I first started.
At Charing Cross Road, Officer Grabensky had finally left his position directing traffic. It looked as if he had gotten everyone off, but now the fire was closing in on him. He got into his car and began heading down the hill. Rounding a curve, he saw a family stranded on the side of the road. He quickly stopped, bolted from his car, and directed them to get in. He told them he'd do everything he could to get them to safety, but they needed to brace for the worst. He advised everyone to keep their heads down and pray.
I think we're gonna make it.
He now knew the only way out would be driving straight through the fire. The Oakland fire had been raging for the better part of a day. Over 1,800 firefighters from 21 counties had responded. This was the largest statewide coordinated fire disaster effort ever undertaken. In a concrete parking garage beneath the rubble of what was once the Parkwood Apartments, Charlie Tucker had taken refuge in his car. He had been there for more than 3 hours, and the garage was now filled with dense smoke. Hoping the fire above him had abated, he felt he had no choice but to get out. Stunned firemen watched as Tucker, covered with ash and dirt, walked out of the ruins. They had no idea that anyone was in the garage, and were even more amazed that he had survived. After what seemed like an eternity, but was really only a matter of hours, Lynn Harrison and firefighters Mike Dolan and Steve Cuneo decided to leave the safety of the swimming pool.
I was absolutely, completely shocked at what I saw. I mean, I was not prepared in any way, shape, or form for what I saw. I just thought I would see what I'd seen of burned out houses before, maybe, part of a wall standing in your fireplace and, the tub, the oven, whatever, just remnants of your house. There wasn't anything standing, no fireplaces. All the bricks had melted.
But her most devastating loss was the death of her pets.
We found the bodies of my cats, but the dogs' bodies were never found. I just kind of knew that the way things happened and so fast, they were small dogs. They weighed 6 and 8 pounds. I don't think they could have outrun that fire.
Late that day, the fierce winds started dying down. They were replaced by a gentle sea breeze that deposited a light mist over the entire area.
The turning point was a combination. It was basically the wind died down around 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. The fire quit spreading so fast, and you had a whole bunch of fresh resources coming in.
By 8 a.m. the next morning, officials declared the fire contained. The final toll of this disaster, over 100 people injured and 25 dead, including 11 on Charing Cross Road. Over 3,000 houses, along with more than 400 apartments, were leveled. 2 square miles of land was scorched. In all, over $1.5 billion worth of damage. In the aftermath of the fire, the stories of survival and heroism left a bittersweet taste in the mouths of all who went through it. After saving and evacuating countless people, Officer Grabensky was found dead, face down near his police car. He was lying on top of a badly burned child. His radio was a few feet away, still crackling with transmissions. Dr. Sanders credits Officer Grabensky with saving his life.
Even 12 years later, I still get a little emotional on this one. By being able to keep people moving and not panicking himself and putting himself in harm's way, he was able to keep the traffic moving in all the direction we could get out.
Lynn Harrison is grateful to her rescuers, Mike Dolan and Steve Cuneo. As a result of their experience in the pool together, the 3 of them have become lifelong friends.
If the firemen hadn't been there, I would have died. There's just no doubt about it.
And for the Maxwell Fierro family, surviving the fire was only the first of 2 miracles they would experience. The next morning, Sally gave birth to a baby boy.
I had a very hard time having a child. So he was much wanted. I mean, this was just to me like the miracle that I was finally able to have this baby and to carry it to term without any problems.
The only glitch was that the hospital had a policy of sending home healthy mothers the day after a successful birth.
They said, you have to go home, and I started to cry. And I said, I don't have a home, and I'm not going. They just, the nurses looked at each other, they went to the doctor, and they decided I could stay another day.
For the Solid family.
In the aftermath of the Oakland Berkeley fire, many lessons were learned, especially how firefighters there now react to any call.
If there is a fire there, people jump on it quick and they stop it. If there is a fire that gets even a couple of acres, people are there all night. They make sure it's out. We do everything possible. We don't